My name is Mallory Ashford, and I'm 24 years old. Right now, I'm staring at a padlock on my childhood bedroom door, installed just an hour ago by my own father. He told me I'm grounded until I apologize to his new wife, Veronica, for supposedly ruining her designer dress with red wine at dinner tonight. But here's the truth. She deliberately bumped my arm, then twisted the whole story. Dad's ultimatum was brutal and cold. You stay in this house until you apologize properly, and you're grounded from accessing your trust fund. As I stand here, humiliated and trapped, I hear Veronica's voice drifting from downstairs, speaking on her phone in a hushed tone that makes my blood run cold. Phase 1 complete, she says with a satisfied laugh. Now we move to the real prize. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and if you've ever dealt with a toxic family situation, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone in this. Make sure to subscribe because this story gets absolutely wild, and you won't believe what my father discovered about his precious new wife. Trust me, you need to hear how this all unraveled. 6 months ago, my life was completely different. My mother, Catherine Ashford, was alive, and our family actually meant something. She was the heart of everything we had, the person who kept my father grounded and our home filled with warmth and genuine love. Mom died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday evening, and the pain of losing her felt like someone had ripped my heart straight out of my chest. My father, Gerald Ashford, is the CEO of Ashford Technologies, a company currently in negotiations for a $50 million deal with Japanese investors. Mom had always been his partner in every sense, advising him on business decisions and keeping him connected to what really mattered in life. When she died, I watched my father transform into someone I barely recognized, a hollow shell of the man who used to read me bedtime stories and teach me about integrity in business. I had just graduated with honors in business administration from Columbia, and Mom had been so proud, talking about how I would join the company and eventually take over the family legacy. She had plans for us, for the future, for building something meaningful together. But then she was gone, and suddenly everything felt pointless. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and pitying faces, people telling me how sorry they were while I stood there numb, unable to process that my mother was actually gone forever. Dad threw himself into work, staying at the office until midnight every single night, and I understood because I was doing the same thing, burying myself in anything that would distract me from the crushing grief that threatened to swallow me whole. Then, only 3 months after we buried my mother, Dad came home one evening with a woman on his arm. Her name was Veronica, and she was 32 years old, which meant she was only 8 years older than me. Dad introduced her as someone he met at a grief support group, calling her his wellness consultant, who had helped him process his feelings about losing Mom. I felt sick to my stomach watching them together. The way she touched his arm with false sympathy and looked at him with eyes that seemed calculating rather than caring. Veronica was beautiful in that polished, manufactured way, with perfectly highlighted hair, designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The red flags started immediately, and I noticed every single one of them even though Dad seemed completely blind to what was happening right in front of his face. Veronica knew too much about our family finances for someone Dad had supposedly just met, casually mentioning details about investments and accounts that should have been private information. She kept pushing Dad to change his will, claiming it was for tax purposes and that she was just trying to help him protect his assets for the future. Whenever Dad was in the room, Veronica was all sweetness and light, touching his hand gently and speaking in soft, caring tones about how much she wanted to support him through his grief. But the moment he left the room, her entire demeanor would shift, and she'd look at me with cold eyes that held something dark and predatory. One of the first things Veronica did after moving into our house was fire Rosa, our housekeeper who had been with our family for 20 years. Rosa had practically helped raise me, and she had loved my mother dearly. Veronica claimed that Rosa was stealing small items from the house, which was an absolute lie, but Dad believed her without question. Rosa left in tears, and I felt helpless to stop it. In Rosa's place, Veronica brought in her own person, a man named Dimitri, who supposedly managed the household but gave me the creeps every time I saw him. Dimitri was tall and intimidating, with dead eyes and a way of appearing silently in doorways that made me constantly look over my shoulder in my own home. The first major attack happened 2 months before the wine incident that got me locked in my room like a prisoner. My mother's heirloom sapphire necklace, a piece of jewelry that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in her family, suddenly disappeared from the safe in Dad's study. I had been planning to wear it to a charity gala in Mom's memory, but when I went to get it, the necklace was gone. The entire house was searched, and then Veronica claimed she found it hidden in my dresser drawer. She brought it to Dad with tears streaming down her face, sobbing about how she just wanted to be accepted into this family, but I clearly hated her so much that I was trying to frame her for theft. It was a masterful performance, and Dad fell for every second of it. He forced me to apologize to Veronica while she stood there with fake tears and wounded eyes, playing the victim so convincingly that I almost doubted my own memory of never touching that necklace. The sick feeling in my stomach grew worse when I saw Veronica wearing that same sapphire necklace at a charity gala 2 weeks later, displayed prominently around her neck like a trophy. When I confronted her about it, she smiled sweetly and said Dad had given it to her as a gift because he wanted her to feel like part of the family. I immediately went to Dad, furious and hurt that he would give away Mom's jewelry without even asking me. But he just looked tired and disappointed. "Your mother would want me to be happy," he said in a flat voice that told me he'd already made up his mind about everything. "She would want me to move forward with my life, instead of living in the past." That conversation broke something inside me because I realized Dad was so deep in grief and manipulation that he couldn't see what was happening right in front of him. My best friend since childhood, Sutton, came over that night and found me crying in my room, surrounded by photos of Mom and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. Sutton held me while I sobbed, and then looked me straight in the eye with the seriousness I'd come to rely on over the years of our friendship. "Something's really wrong with that woman," Sutton said quietly, her hand gripping mine tightly. "I don't know what her game is, but you need to be careful and start documenting everything that happens." That night, I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, every strange comment, every suspicious thing I noticed about Veronica and her constant companion Dimitri. The first day of being grounded felt surreal, like I had somehow stepped into a nightmare version of my own life, where the rules of reality no longer applied. I woke up that morning and discovered that Dad had frozen all of my credit cards without warning, leaving me completely dependent on him for everything. My phone had been restricted to only call him or emergency services, cutting me off from my friends and any support system I might have had outside the house. The estate we lived on was gated and sprawling, sitting on 10 acres of perfectly manicured grounds that now felt more like a prison than a home. Dad made it crystal clear that I was not allowed to leave the property for any reason, and Dimitri had been assigned to watch over me, which was just a polite way of saying he was my guard and jailer. Veronica played her role perfectly, transforming into the wounded victim for anyone who would listen. She made a point of visiting neighbors at the country club, dabbing at her eyes with expensive tissues while spinning elaborate lies about Gerald's troubled daughter who was going through some kind of breakdown. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was telling people it'd been stealing from the family to support various bad habits, painting a picture of me as unstable and untrustworthy. She even showed doctored photos that supposedly showed me partying recklessly, but I recognized them as pictures from a charity fundraiser I'd attended months ago, where Shed manipulated the images to make it look like something completely different. The character assassination was methodical and devastating. Former family friends who had known me since I was a little girl started avoiding my calls, their numbers suddenly going to voicemail every single time I tried to reach out. Dad's business partners began questioning his judgment about grooming me for a leadership position in the company, whispering concerns about whether I was mentally stable enough to handle corporate responsibilities. I could feel the walls closing in around me as Veronica systematically destroyed my reputation and isolated me from everyone who might have been able to help me see the truth about what was really happening. My first real ally appeared in the most unexpected way. Marcus was our gardener, a 65-year-old man who had worked for the Ashford family for 30 years and had known my mother since before she even married Dad. He had quiet dignity and steady hands that had tended every flower in Mom's beloved garden, and I'd always felt safe around him growing up. One afternoon while I was sitting in the garden, trying to find some small measure of peace among the roses Mom had planted, Marcus approached me with cautious steps. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then knelt down beside me, pretending to work on the flower bed while he spoke in a low voice that barely carried beyond where I sat. "I've seen that Dmitri going through your father's office at night," Marcus told me, his weathered face creased with concern. "Hess taking photos of documents and making copies of files that he shouldn't have access to at all." Marcus also mentioned that Head noticed Veronica meeting with strange men in town, well-dressed individuals who didn't look like they belonged in our small community and who always seemed to be conducting business in hushed, secretive conversations. Marcus promised to help me gather information however he could, and I felt a surge of hope knowing that at least one person in this house believed me and was willing to take risks to help. He explained that he was immune to being fired because my mother had insisted on giving him a lifetime employment contract years ago, one of many small kindnesses that showed who Mom really was as a person. Veronica's manipulation deepened with each passing day, her web of lies growing more complex and dangerous. She convinced Dad that I needed professional help for what she called my deteriorating mental state, and Shed already arranged for a psychiatrist named Dr. Sheffield to come evaluate me. What Dad didn't know was that Dr. Sheffield was actually Veronica's former boyfriend, a detail I discovered through some frantic internet searching on the limited access I still had to my laptop. The plan was becoming horrifyingly clear. Have me declared mentally unstable and unfit to inherit anything, leaving Dad vulnerable and alone with Veronica positioned to take everything. I came dangerously close to my first real breaking point that week. Locked in my room and feeling the weight of isolation crushing down on me from all sides. I spent hours crying while looking at photos of Mom, remembering her laugh and her advice, and the way she always knew exactly what to say to make me feel strong enough to face anything. There was a moment, sitting on my floor at 3 in the morning, when I seriously considered just apologizing to Veronica and trying to escape this nightmare by any means necessary, even if it meant giving up and letting her win. Maybe I should just say the words she wants to hear and then figure out how to get away from this house and start over somewhere else, I thought desperately, feeling defeated and exhausted beyond measure. But then I found something that changed everything. Hidden in the back of my closet, tucked behind some old shoeboxes I hadn't touched in years, was my mother's personal journal. I'd forgotten she kept one, and as I flipped through the pages, I saw her familiar handwriting documenting everything from daily thoughts to business concerns. My hands started shaking when I reached the final entry, dated exactly 1 week before her death. "I'm worried about Gerald's new business partner," Mom had written in her careful script. "Something feels wrong about the Henderson deal. The numbers don't add up, and I keep getting the feeling we're being watched and evaluated for something I don't understand. I need to investigate this further and figure out what's really going on before it's too late." Reading those words, I realized my mother had suspected something was wrong in the weeks before she died. She'd been investigating, asking questions, looking into things that someone clearly didn't want her to discover. The car accident that killed her suddenly seemed a lot less accidental, and I felt my grief transform into something harder and more determined. Mom had been trying to protect Dad and protect our family from something dangerous, and I wasn't going to let her death be in vain. Whatever Veronica was planning, whatever scheme she was running, I was going to expose it all and make sure justice was served for my mother's memory. I made a conscious decision to change my approach, realizing that showing my anger and resistance was only making things worse and giving Veronica more ammunition to use against me. Instead, I started pretending to be broken and compliant, playing the role of the defeated daughter who had finally accepted that she was wrong about everything. It went against every instinct I had, but I forced myself to approach Veronica with humble, apologetic eyes and ask her sweetly if she would teach me how to apologize properly. I told her I wanted to learn how to be more like her, how to be gracious and kind the way she was with Dad, laying the flattery on thick while internally screaming at how fake every word sounded. Veronica, thinking she had finally won and broken my spirit completely, became noticeably more careless in her behavior. She started allowing me small freedoms, like supervised walks in the garden where Marcus could pass me information, and access to the library where I could use the computer under the pretense of researching self-improvement and therapy techniques. She was so convinced of her complete control over the situation that she stopped watching her words as carefully, occasionally letting small details slip about her past or her plans that I immediately documented in the journal I kept hidden under my mattress. The third major attack came without warning. delivered through Dad's lawyer during what should have been a routine legal visit. Mr. Preston had been the Ashford family attorney for over 20 years, and he was actually loyal to my mother's memory even though he had to maintain professional relationships with Dad. He arrived at the house one afternoon for a meeting with Dad, and Veronica immediately tried to block him from speaking to me privately, claiming I was too fragile for legal discussions and needed to rest. But Dad, still holding on to some small shred of his former self, overruled her and allowed Mr. Preston 10 minutes alone with me in the library. Mr. Preston's face was grave as he closed the door behind him and spoke in an urgent whisper that sent chills down my spine. Your father is about to sign papers that will transfer control of your trust fund to Veronica until you're 35 years old, he told me, his eyes filled with concern and frustration. The excuse is that it's to protect you from yourself during this difficult time of mental instability, but we both know what this really is. That trust fund represented $10 million that my mother had set up independently from Dad's assets, money that was supposed to be mine to use for education, starting a business, or whatever future I wanted to build. Mr. Preston explained that I had exactly 72 hours before Dad signed those papers, and once his signature was on the documents, reversing the decision would require a lengthy legal battle that would drain resources and time I didn't have. That same night, Sutton proved exactly why she'd been my best friend since we were 7 years old by literally climbing over the estate wall like some kind of action movie hero. She'd been on the gymnastics team in high school and apparently still had the athletic skills to scale a 10-foot wall, drop into our property, and make her way to my window without being detected by security cameras or Dimitri's patrols. She brought me a secret burner phone, hugging me tightly while I cried with relief at seeing her face and knowing I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. But Sutton brought more than just emotional support and a way to communicate with the outside world. She'd been conducting her own investigation into Veronica's background, using her connections and research skills to dig up information that made my blood run cold. Veronica's real name was Vera Castellano, and she'd done this exact same scheme before with a wealthy widower in California named Richard Morrison. Richard had lost his wife to cancer, met Vera at a grief support group less than a month later, married her within 6 months, and then died mysteriously in his home exactly 1 year after the wedding. Vera inherited everything, and while the death was investigated by police due to suspicious circumstances, nothing was ever proven, and she walked away with Morrison's entire $15 million estate. Sutton had printed out news articles about the case and police reports that had been filed, showing me evidence of a pattern that was both terrifying and infuriating. How had Veronica been allowed to do this again after being investigated once? How had no one connected the dots or stopped her from targeting another grieving family? The answer was that she was careful, patient, and extremely good at covering her tracks while playing the role of the innocent victim. Sutton and I spent hours that night going through everything she'd found, building a timeline and looking for connections we could use to expose Veronica before she succeeded in her plan to take everything from my father and possibly harm him the same way she'd likely harmed Richard Morrison. Marcus provided another crucial piece of information when he caught Dimitri installing hidden cameras in Dad's office late one night. Marcus had been doing his rounds, checking on the greenhouse systems, when he saw light coming from the office windows and decided to investigate. He watched through a side window as Dimitri carefully placed tiny cameras in the corners of the room, angling them to capture Dad's desk and computer screen. Marcus confronted me about it the next morning, and we realized together that Dimitri wasn't just Veronica's bodyguard or household manager. He was her half-brother, and they were working together as a team to steal corporate secrets from Ashford Technologies. The $50 million deal with Japanese investors involved proprietary technology that competitors would pay enormous amounts of money to access, and if Veronica could get her hands on those files through the cameras Dimitri was installing, she could sell that information and make millions on top of whatever she planned to steal through marriage and inheritance. I spent the next day researching the Henderson deal that Mom had mentioned in her journal, trying to understand what she'd been investigating before she died. Henderson had been a potential merger partner 3 months before Mom's death, but the deal fell through after he warned Dad about security concerns and potential leaks within Ashford Technologies. I found emails where Mr. Henderson specifically mentioned that sensitive information had shown up in competitor presentations, suggesting someone inside the company was selling secrets. Mom had started investigating who the leak might be, conducting quiet interviews with staff and reviewing security protocols to find the source. The timeline was chilling. Mom started her investigation on a Monday, and she died in a car accident the following Sunday night. Sitting in the library with all of these pieces of information spread out in front of me, I came to a realization that made me physically ill. My mother's car accident wasn't an accident at all. Veronica had appeared at Dad's grief support group only 2 days after Mom died, which meant Shed somehow known to be there and ready to make her move almost immediately. The official accident report cited brake failure as the cause, but Mom had just had the car serviced the week before at the dealership where Shed taken it for maintenance for 15 years. What were the odds that brakes would fail so catastrophically within a week of a professional service? I needed to find the mechanic who had worked on Mom's car and get answers about what really happened, but I was trapped in this house with limited resources and a deadline counting down until Dad signed away my trust fund and gave Veronica even more power over both of our lives. When Dad's executive assistant, Lauren Mitchell, reached out to me with sympathy and offers to help, I wanted so desperately to believe that someone in Dad's inner circle had finally seen through Veronica's manipulation. Lauren had worked for Ashford Technologies for 8 years, and I'd always thought of her as competent and trustworthy, someone who genuinely cared about the company and Dad's well-being. She sent me a carefully worded email through the library computer, expressing concern about some of the changes Veronica was implementing and suggesting that she could help me access company files that might prove Veronica's real intentions. I was so desperate and isolated that I made a critical mistake. I trusted her. I shared some of what I'd learned through Sutton's investigation and Marcus' observations, explaining my theory that Veronica was stealing corporate secrets and had possibly been involved in Mom's death. Lauren seemed appropriately shocked and concerned, promising to look into things discreetly and help me gather the evidence I needed to convince Dad of the truth. We exchanged several messages over the course of 3 days, and I felt a growing sense of hope that maybe I was finally building a strong enough case to break through Dad's denial and expose Veronica before it was too late. What I didn't know was that Lauren had been secretly working for Veronica the entire time. Lauren was actually the corporate leak that Mom had been investigating before her death, the person who had been selling information to competitors for the past 2 years. Veronica had discovered Lauren's embezzlement and theft almost immediately after starting her relationship with Dad, and instead of exposing her, Veronica had used that information as blackmail. She had photos and evidence of Lauren's crimes, threatening to destroy her career and send her to prison unless Lauren became her eyes and ears inside Ashford Technologies and helped sabotage any attempts to investigate Veronica's activities. The setup Veronica and Lauren orchestrated together was elaborate and devastating. Using the information I had foolishly shared, Veronica knew exactly what evidence I was looking for and what theories I was building. She moved quickly to discredit everything before I could present it to Dad or anyone else who might actually listen. She had Lauren plant confidential corporate documents in my room, marked with security classifications and containing sensitive information about the Japanese deal. Then Veronica called the police, sobbing hysterically about how Shed discovered that Dad's troubled daughter was trying to sabotage his business out of jealousy and spite, possibly planning to sell company secrets to competitors. I was in the library when Dad stormed in with 2 police officers, his face twisted with pain and betrayal in a way that broke my heart, even though I knew I was innocent. He held up a folder containing the planted documents, his hands shaking as he demanded to know how I could do this to him after everything our family had built over generations. I tried to explain that the documents were planted, that I'd never seen them before in my life, but my protests sounded weak even to my own ears. How could I prove a negative? How could I demonstrate that I hadn't done something when evidence existed suggesting otherwise? Veronica stood behind Dad with perfect tears rolling down her cheeks, playing the role of the heartbroken stepmother who just wanted to help this troubled girl but had been betrayed and attacked at every turn. Dad made the decision right then, standing in the library surrounded by police and with Veronica's hands on his shoulders, to have me temporarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. Had been convinced that my mental state had deteriorated to the point where I was a danger to myself and others, and that professional intervention was the only way to help me before I destroyed everything in some kind of breakdown. The private facility Veronica had recommended was actually a place she controlled through various shell companies and friendly doctors, somewhere she could keep me locked away indefinitely while she completed her plan to take everything from Dad. I came terrifyingly close to my second breaking point that night. Locked in my room, with Dimitri standing guard outside my door, and knowing that I had less than 12 hours before they would take me away to the psychiatric facility. I felt completely alone and defeated, all of my allies cut off, and all of my evidence dismissed as the ravings of an unstable mind. I managed to send one last message to Sutton through the secret phone shed given me, typing with shaking fingers while tears blurred my vision. "If something happens to me," I wrote, "investigate everything, and don't stop until you find the truth about what Veronica did to Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop her." But then something unexpected happened that gave me a thin thread of hope to cling to in the darkness. Mr. Preston arrived at the house, claiming he had urgent papers for Dad to sign related to the Japanese deal. While Dad was distracted in his office reviewing the legal documents, Mr. Preston managed to slip a note under my bedroom door, pushing it through the crack where the carpet didn't quite meet the threshold. I grabbed it immediately, my heart pounding as I unfolded the small piece of paper and read his careful handwriting. "Catherine suspected Veronica 6 months before she died," the note said. "I have her evidence. Hold on just a little longer, Mr. Preston explained in the note that Mom had hired a private investigator before her death, someone she trusted to look into Veronica's background and activities after she started noticing suspicious behavior. The investigator's complete report was stored in a safety deposit box that only Mr. Preston and I could access together using our identification and signatures. But we needed to get to the bank before my 72 hours expired, and with me locked in my room under guard and scheduled to be committed to a psychiatric facility, that seemed impossible. The note ended with instructions to be ready at noon the next day, when Mr. Preston promised he would create a diversion that would give me a chance to escape. The timing of everything collided in the worst possible way. The Japanese delegation was arriving that afternoon for the final negotiations on the $50 million deal, led by a respected businessman named Mr. Takahashi, who Dad had been courting for months. A formal welcome dinner was planned at the estate that evening, with Veronica positioning herself as the gracious hostess and Dad's supportive partner. She saw this dinner as her opportunity to cement her role as Mrs. Ashford in front of important witnesses, making it even harder for anyone to question her position in Dad's life. I realized that if I could somehow get to Mr. Takahashi with the truth, he might be willing to help, but I was still locked in my room with the psychiatrist scheduled to arrive at 3 o'clock to begin my evaluation and commitment process. Marcus created his diversion at exactly noon, just as Mr. Preston had promised. He staged a small fire in the garden shed by overloading some electrical equipment, making sure it produced a lot of dramatic smoke but wasn't actually dangerous enough to cause real damage. The smoke billowed up in dark clouds visible from the house, and Dimitri immediately abandoned his post outside my door to rush downstairs and help contain the situation. I heard his heavy footsteps pounding down the stairs, and I knew this was my only chance to escape before the psychiatrist arrived to take me away to the facility Veronica controlled. Getting out of a second-floor bedroom window is significantly harder than movies make it look, and I learned that lesson while trying to tie bedsheets together with hands that shook from fear and adrenaline. I secured one end to the heavy oak bed frame, tested the knot multiple times, then pushed the window open as quietly as I could manage. The drop to the ground looked terrifyingly far, and I had a moment of pure panic wondering if I was about to break both my legs trying to escape. I lowered myself out the window, gripping the sheets while my arms burned with effort, and started climbing down inch by inch while trying not to look at the ground below. About halfway down, my sweaty hands slipped on the fabric, and I fell the rest of the way, landing hard on the flower bed beneath my window. Marcus appeared immediately, helping me up with strong, steady hands while checking to make sure I hadn't seriously injured myself. We'd succeeded in the first part of the plan, but now we had to get off the property and to the bank before Dimitri realized I was gone, and Veronica sent people to intercept us. Marcus led me to his old truck, which had strategically parked behind the greenhouse out of sight of the main house and security cameras. We climbed in and he started driving toward the estate gates, trying to move quickly but not so fast that would attract attention. We almost made it through the gates when Dimitri discovered my empty room. I heard his shouting through the open truck window as Marcus accelerated, and seconds later I saw Dimitri's black SUV pulling out of the garage in pursuit. What followed was a car chase straight out of an action movie, except it was happening in broad daylight on the streets of our small town, with Marcus' ancient pickup truck trying to outrun a much faster and more powerful vehicle. Marcus drove with surprising skill for someone his age, taking turns sharply and using his knowledge of local shortcuts to try to lose our pursuer. We barely made it to the bank with minutes to spare before closing time, Marcus parking crookedly in front of the building while Dimitri's SUV screeched to a stop behind us. We ran into the bank with Dimitri right behind us, and I shouted for security while Marcus blocked his path. The bank manager, recognizing me from years of coming in with Mom, immediately intervened and had security escort Dimitri out of the building while threatening to call the police. Mr. Preston was already there waiting for us, looking enormously relieved when he saw me arrive safely. We had to move fast because I knew Dimitri would be calling Veronica and she would find ways to intercept us once we left the bank's relative safety. The safety deposit box contained everything we needed to prove Veronica's crimes. There was a comprehensive private investigator's report on Vera Castellano that detailed her entire criminal history, including information about Richard Morrison's suspicious death in California and 2 other wealthy men who had died or lost everything after becoming involved with her. The investigator had found photos of Veronica meeting with known corporate spies, individuals with criminal records related to industrial espionage and information theft. There were bank records showing payments from competitor companies into accounts traced back to Veronica through various shell corporations. The most damning evidence was a sworn statement from a mechanic named Robert Chen who worked at the dealership where Mom had her car serviced. He testified in writing that 2 days before Mom's accident, a woman matching Veronica's description had approached him with $50,000 in cash to tamper with Catherine Ashford's brakes. Chen claimed he initially agreed because he was desperate for money to pay for his daughter's medical treatments, but his conscience got the better of him and he backed out of the arrangement. Instead of sabotaging the car, he documented everything Veronica had asked him to do and reported it to the police immediately. But the most shocking revelation was that someone else must have tampered with the brakes after Chen refused, because the car did fail catastrophically, suggesting Veronica had a backup plan or additional accomplices. The final piece of evidence was a video recording Mom had made just 1 day before her death. I watched through tears as she appeared on the screen looking tired but determined, speaking directly to the camera with the intention that someone would see this if something happened to her. "If you're watching this," Mom said in her steady voice, "then something has happened to me and you need to know that Veronica is dangerous. I've uncovered evidence that she's part of an organized group that targets wealthy individuals, particularly those who are vulnerable through grief or life transitions. She's planning something bigger than just marriage fraud. She has access to sensitive corporate information and I believe she's going to try to steal technology secrets or sabotage the Japanese deal. Please protect your father and stop her before she destroys everything we built." Watching my mother speak those words from beyond the grave, knowing she'd been trying to protect us and had been murdered for getting too close to the truth, filled me with a rage so intense I could barely breathe. But I didn't have time to process my emotions because while we were at the bank, Veronica was making her final devastating move. She'd convinced Dad to sign documents that removed me entirely from his will, gave her power of attorney over all his affairs, and transferred significant company shares into a trust that she controlled as the trustee. Dad signed everything while I was at the bank, fighting for my life and freedom, believing he was protecting his company from his mentally unstable daughter who had tried to sabotage the Japanese deal. I returned to the estate during the Japanese delegation dinner, covered in dirt from my escape, with scratches on my arms from climbing out the window, and carrying a folder full of evidence that was about to blow Veronica's entire scheme apart. The formal dining room was filled with elegantly dressed guests, Japanese businessmen in expensive suits sitting across from Dad's executives, while Veronica played hostess in a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's cars. The moment I walked through the door, disheveled and intense, the entire room fell silent, and every eye turned to stare at me. Veronica recovered from her shock almost instantly, her face transforming into an expression of concern mixed with embarrassment. "You see, Mr. Takahashi," she said smoothly while gesturing toward me. "This is the troubled daughter I mentioned to you earlier. She's been struggling with some mental health challenges since losing her mother. and I'm afraid she needs professional help that we've been trying to arrange. Veronica's performance was flawless, her voice filled with sympathetic sadness while her eyes shot daggers at me that promised severe consequences for this interruption. Dad stood up from his seat, his face flushing with anger and humiliation that I would crash this important dinner in such a state. He ordered security to remove me from the dining room immediately, not wanting his business deal destroyed by what he perceived as my continued breakdown and inability to accept his new life. But then something unexpected happened that changed the entire trajectory of the evening. Mr. Takahashi, the leader of the Japanese delegation, held up his hand in a gesture that commanded immediate silence and respect. "Wait, Mr. Takahashi said firmly, his accented English clear and authoritative. "Let her speak. In our culture, we honor the voice of family, especially children who show courage in difficult circumstances. I would like to hear what Miss Ashford has to say before we proceed with any business discussions." His executives nodded in agreement, and suddenly I had the floor with everyone's attention focused entirely on me, giving me the opportunity I desperately needed to expose everything before Veronica could silence me permanently. I presented the evidence methodically, starting with the private investigator's report on Vera Castellano's true identity and criminal background. I explained the pattern of wealthy widowers Shed targeted, the suspicious deaths and financial devastation Shed left in her wake across multiple states. I showed the room photos of Veronica meeting with corporate spies, individuals whose backgrounds Mr. Takahashi's own security team could easily verify. I presented bank records demonstrating payments from competitor companies, proving that Ashford Technologies had been compromised and sensitive information about the Japanese deal was likely already in the hands of their rivals. Then I played my mother's video testimony, and the room became so quiet I could hear people breathing. Catherine Ashford appeared on the screen speaking calmly and clearly about the investigation Shed conducted, the evidence Shed found, and her concerns about Veronica's true intentions. When Mom's face disappeared from the screen, I showed them the mechanic's sworn statement about Veronica attempting to have my mother's car sabotaged. I finished by explaining the timeline. Mom started investigating on Monday, she was dead by Sunday, and Veronica appeared in Dad's life within 48 hours of the funeral. Veronica tried desperately to maintain her composure, but I could see cracks forming in her perfect mask. She claimed loudly that all of the evidence was fabricated, that I was mentally ill and had constructed this elaborate conspiracy theory out of grief and jealousy. She appealed to Dad with tears and trembling hands, begging him to see that his daughter needed help and was trying to destroy their happiness with lies. But I had one more piece of evidence that she hadn't anticipated. Detailed bank records showing payments from 3 different competitor companies to accounts that I could trace directly to Veronica through shell corporations and offshore accounts that Marcus had helped me track down. Dad's face went completely white as he processed what he was seeing and hearing. The woman Head trusted, the person Head chosen over his own daughter, had murdered his wife and was actively stealing from his company. Everything Head believed for the past 6 months was a carefully constructed lie, and the reality of his mistakes hit him like a physical blow. He collapsed back into his chair, his breath coming in short gasps while he stared at Veronica like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Dimitri, seeing that everything was falling apart, attempted to flee the dining room, but Mr. Takahashi's security detail, highly trained professionals who had been quietly observing throughout the evening, moved to block the exits with efficient precision. Dimitri was caught before he made it to the door, held in place by 2 security guards while he struggled and cursed. But Veronica, cornered and desperate, decided to go down fighting in a way that shocked everyone in that room. She stood up from the table with her composure shattering like glass, her beautiful face twisted into something ugly and hateful that showed her true nature. She started laughing, a harsh sound that held no humor, and pulled a folder from her designer handbag that she slammed down on the table. "You want to know the truth? Fine," she snarled, abandoning all pretense of being the sweet, caring wife. "Yes, I killed Catherine. I paid to have her brakes fail because she was getting too close to information that would have ruined everything. But you can't prove it because that mechanic you mentioned? He disappeared 6 months ago. No body, no crime, no case." The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry voices, but Veronica wasn't finished. She smiled coldly at Dad, enjoying the devastation on his face while delivering her final attack. "And those documents Gerald signed today? They're already filed with the county clerk and my lawyers. Even if you arrest me, I legally own 51% of this company now. I hold all the cards. And if you push this, it'll destroy Ashford Technologies from the inside. It'll sell every secret to your competitors, including all the details of this Japanese deal. Your father's legacy will be worthless, and there's absolutely nothing any of you can do to stop me. The tension in the room was suffocating as everyone processed what Veronica had just admitted. Shed confessed to murder in front of dozens of witnesses, but she also held legal documents giving her control over the company. We were in a standoff where exposing her crimes might result in the complete destruction of everything my family had built over 3 generations. Veronica stood there with triumph in her eyes, believing Shed won even in defeat because she could still inflict massive damage as revenge. Then, Lauren Mitchell, Dad's executive assistant who I'd thought was Veronica's ally, suddenly stood up from her seat at the far end of the table. Her face was streaming with tears, and her hands were shaking as she held up her cell phone for everyone to see. "I'm sorry," Lauren sobbed, looking directly at me with genuine remorse. I was desperate and scared, and she was blackmailing me with evidence of my embezzlement. But I recorded every single conversation I had with her. I have months of recordings proving she planned your mother's murder, planned to steal company secrets, and manipulated Gerald into signing those documents. I have proof of everything. Lauren's confession and evidence completely changed the situation. She handed her phone to Mr. Takahashi's security team, who immediately began documenting the recordings while calling the police. Veronica's face went from triumphant to panicked as she realized that her admission had been captured by witnesses and recordings, and there would be no escaping consequences this time. Mr. Takahashi stood up with the dignified bearing of someone who commanded respect through character rather than force. He looked around the room with sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everyone present, then began speaking in a measured tone that carried absolute authority. In Japan, we have a saying, "The nail that sticks out gets hammered down." But we also believe in justice above profit and honor above convenience. What I have witnessed here tonight has revealed more about the character of this company than any business presentation could ever demonstrate. He explained that his company had conducted their own extensive background investigation on everyone involved with the potential merger, including Veronica. They'd discovered her pattern of targeting wealthy men and had actually found connections to the suspicious death of Richard Morrison in California. Mr. NSI Takahashi's security team had been investigating quietly throughout the entire courtship period, waiting to see if Gerald Ashford would discover the truth about the woman Head brought into his life and his business. This dinner, he revealed, was actually a test, not just of business acumen, but of character and family values that were essential to Japanese corporate culture. The revelation that Mr. Takahashi had known about Veronica's background and was testing Dad's judgment felt like another betrayal, but I understood the logic from a business perspective. They needed to know if their potential American partner had the wisdom and integrity to protect his own interests and see through manipulation. Dad had failed that test by choosing Veronica over his own daughter and ignoring clear warning signs, but my actions tonight had demonstrated the kind of courage and determination that Mr. Takahashi's company valued in business partners. Mr. Takahashi's legal team, who had been present at the dinner disguised as junior executives, had been recording the entire evening with sophisticated equipment. They had captured Veronica's full confession about murdering my mother, her threats to destroy the company, and her admission of corporate espionage. More importantly, under Japanese corporate law that governed their side of the merger agreement, any contracts signed under fraudulent circumstances could be immediately voided. All of the documents Dad had signed that day giving Veronica control were legally worthless the moment her true identity and criminal intentions were exposed. The police arrived within minutes, having been called by Mr. Preston before I even returned to the estate. They'd been waiting outside for the right moment to enter, coordinated with Mr. Takahashi's security team to ensure they had enough evidence for a solid arrest. 2 officers approached Veronica while reading her rights, and she fought them like a cornered animal, screaming threats and obscenities while they handcuffed her hands behind her back. Her designer dress was torn, her perfect hair was disheveled, and the mask of beauty and grace had completely fallen away to reveal the predator underneath. Dimitri, faced with decades in prison for his role in murder, corporate espionage, and various other crimes, immediately started trying to negotiate a deal with prosecutors. He revealed that he and Veronica were actually half-siblings who had been running this scam together for 8 years across 5 different states. He provided detailed information about 3 men who had died mysteriously after becoming involved with Veronica, and 2 others who had lost everything in devastating divorces where Shed managed to take their entire fortunes. Dmitry had access to bank account information in the Cayman Islands, where Veronica had been hiding more than $20 million stolen from her previous victims, evidence that would help prosecutors build an overwhelming case against both of them. The hidden third villain in this conspiracy was revealed when Dr. Sheffield, the psychiatrist Veronica had hired to evaluate me, was also arrested. Had been working with Veronica for years, traveling to different states to provide professional medical opinions declaring her victims mentally incompetent so she could take legal control of their affairs. Dr. Sheffield had signed off on at least 3 previous cases where vulnerable men were declared unfit to manage their own finances shortly before dying under suspicious circumstances. The state medical board had actually been investigating him quietly for months after receiving anonymous complaints, and Veronica's arrest provided them with the evidence they needed to revoke his license and charge him with fraud, conspiracy, and being an accessory to multiple murders. As police led Veronica out of the dining room in handcuffs, she turned back to look at me with pure hatred burning in her eyes. "You think you've won?" she screamed, struggling against the officers holding her arms. "I have allies you don't know about. This isn't over. Your father's business partner, Henderson? Ask him where he really was the night your mother died." She planted seeds of doubt and fear, even in her moment of complete defeat, trying to poison every relationship and cast suspicion on everyone around us. Her final act was to suggest that the conspiracy went deeper than anyone knew, that there were more people involved who hadn't been exposed yet. The room slowly emptied as police and security teams escorted various people out for questioning. Dad sat slumped in his chair, looking 20 years older than he had that morning, the weight of his mistakes and his grief crushing down on him visibly. I stood across the room from him, not sure if I could forgive what had done, or if our relationship could ever be repaired after the betrayals and the grounding and his choosing Veronica over his own daughter time after time. "Mr. Takahashi approached me quietly, placed a hand on my shoulder with fatherly concern, and told me that real strength wasn't avoiding mistakes but having the courage to correct them once the truth was revealed. Dad spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for exhaustion, shock, and what his doctors called an acute stress reaction to trauma. I visited him every day despite my anger and hurt, sitting beside his bed while he drifted in and out of sleep. When he was finally awake and stable enough for serious conversation, he broke down crying in a way I'd never seen before, his entire body shaking with sobs while he tried to apologize for everything Head put me through. "I'm so sorry," he repeated over and over, gripping my hand with desperate strength. "I failed you, and I failed your mother. I was so lost in grief that I couldn't see what was right in front of me, and I almost destroyed everything she worked so hard to build." The reconciliation between us was painful and slow, filled with difficult conversations about trust and betrayal and the long road to healing our relationship. Dad had to face the reality that his desperate need to escape his grief had made him vulnerable to manipulation, and that his choices had nearly gotten me committed to a psychiatric facility where I would have been trapped and helpless. I had to face my own anger and decide whether I could forgive him for choosing a con artist over his own daughter, for locking me in my room, for freezing my accounts and treating me like I was the problem, instead of listening when I tried to warn him. Therapy helped both of us process everything, and slowly we started rebuilding something that resembled a father-daughter relationship, though it would never be quite the same as it was before Mom died. The question Veronica had planted about Henderson haunted me until I finally tracked him down and demanded answers. Henderson had been having dinner with my mother the night before her death, which seemed suspicious until he explained the full context with evidence and witnesses to support his story. Head discovered that Veronica was part of a corporate espionage network during a sting operation his own company had been involved with months earlier. He recognized her from surveillance photos when Dad first introduced her at a business function, and Head immediately reached out to Mom to warn her that this woman was dangerous and not who she pretended to be. Mom had been driving home from that dinner meeting when her brakes failed and she crashed, and Henderson had been carrying guilt ever since, believing that if Head warned her sooner or been more emphatic about the danger, she might still be alive. Mr. Takahashi kept his word about proceeding with the merger deal, but he added strict conditions to the agreement. The most significant was that I had to become part of the senior leadership team at Ashford Technologies, with real authority and decision-making power rather than just a figurehead position. "I saw your courage tonight," he told me during a follow-up meeting in his hotel suite. "You fought for truth even when everyone around you had given up. That's the kind of character and strength we want in a business partner." The $50 million deal was finalized with additional clauses requiring mandatory ethics oversight, comprehensive security improvements, and regular audits to ensure no other corporate spies had infiltrated the company. We had to clean house thoroughly at Ashford Technologies. Lauren Mitchell faced embezzlement charges, but received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation and testimony against Veronica and the espionage network. All of the staff members Veronica had personally hired were investigated, and we discovered 2 more corporate spies planted in the IT department who had been copying files and monitoring communications. Dimitri's entire network of contacts had to be identified and removed to make sure Veronica's influence was completely eliminated from our company operations. Rosa, our former housekeeper who had been fired on false theft charges, returned to work with 6 months of back pay, a formal apology, and a generous bonus for the pain and humiliation Shed endured. The new housekeeper and various other staff Veronica had brought in were all terminated, and we hired a professional security firm to conduct background checks on everyone who worked in our home or had access to family information. Marcus moved into the guest house on our property, given a pension and lifetime residence as thanks for his loyalty and the risks he took to help me expose Veronica's crimes. The legal resolution took months to work through the system. Veronica was formally charged with first-degree murder in my mother's death, conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts of fraud, corporate espionage, blackmail, and a long list of other crimes spanning multiple states. She faced life in prison without the possibility of parole, and prosecutors were confident they had overwhelming evidence to secure a conviction. Her assets were frozen and would eventually be used for restitution to her various victims' families, though the money could never truly compensate for the lives Shed destroyed. I took on the difficult task of contacting families of Veronica's previous victims, people who had lost loved ones to her schemes and never gotten real answers or justice. I testified in 3 separate murder cases in different states, helping prosecutors build comprehensive cases that would ensure Veronica never walked free again. The families were grateful to finally have someone acknowledge their pain and take their suspicions seriously, and we formed a network of support for people who'd been targeted by similar con artists and predators. Dad and I attended family therapy twice a week, working through the complicated emotions of grief, betrayal, anger, and the slow process of forgiveness. He had to confront how his desperate desire to avoid pain had made him blind to obvious warning signs and willing to hurt the one person who should have been able to trust him completely. I had to process my own feelings of abandonment and learn how to trust him again after Head chosen a stranger over me repeatedly. It was hard work that required both of us to be vulnerable and honest, but slowly we started finding our way back to each other, building a new relationship that acknowledged past mistakes while moving forward with hope. 6 months after that terrible dinner where everything exploded, I stood in my new office at Ashford Technologies, with the title of Vice President of Operations on my door and actual authority to make decisions that affected the entire company. The Japanese partnership had exceeded all expectations, leading to unprecedented growth and expansion into markets we'd never accessed before. Our company value had more than doubled, and industry analysts were talking about Ashford Technologies as a model for successful international collaboration. Dad had stepped back slightly from day-to-day operations, trusting my leadership and acknowledging that I'd earned my position through courage and competence rather than just family connections. Gerald established the Catherine Ashford Foundation in Mom's memory, creating something beautiful and meaningful from the tragedy of her death. The foundation's mission focused on supporting children who had lost parents and protecting vulnerable adults from predatory relationships like the one that had nearly destroyed our family. We funded free legal services for families fighting financial abuse, supported grief counseling programs, and lobbied for stronger elder protection laws that would make it harder for con artists like Veronica to target people in vulnerable emotional states. Dad threw himself into this work with the same intensity he'd once brought to building his company, and I could see healing happening as he transformed his guilt and grief into action that helped others avoid similar pain. Veronica's trial became a national news story, attracting media attention because of the dramatic nature of her crimes and the multiple victims across different states. I testified with strength and clarity, looking her directly in the eyes while describing everything she'd done to my family and how close she'd come to succeeding in her plan to take everything. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and additional charges were filed in other jurisdictions where her previous victims' families demanded justice. Veronica would spend the rest of her life behind bars, and every year I received notifications when she was denied parole, a reminder that justice had been served. But the real victory wasn't just the legal outcome or the business success. The real victory was finding myself again, discovering strength I didn't know I possessed, and learning that speaking truth, even when everyone doubts you, is worth the cost. It honored my mother's memory by refusing to give up on finding the truth about her death, and it saved other potential victims from suffering the same fate at Veronica's hands. It learned that family bonds can be broken by betrayal, but they can also be repaired through consistent effort and genuine remorse, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting but rather choosing to move forward despite past pain. The lessons I learned through this nightmare became principles I carried into every aspect of my life. I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even when everyone around me insists I'm mistaken or overreacting. I learned that grief makes people vulnerable, but vulnerability doesn't excuse choosing comfort over truth or avoiding difficult realities. I learned that sometimes the people trying to isolate you from your support system are the exact people you should fear most, and that documentation of suspicious behavior isn't paranoia but smart protection. I learned that true allies reveal themselves in crisis moments when there's nothing to gain from loyalty except doing the right thing. Dad's own reflection on everything that happened was painful but necessary for his growth. He had to acknowledge that his desperate need to escape grief had driven him straight into danger, and that choosing the easy comfort Veronica offered over the difficult truth I was trying to tell him nearly cost him everything that mattered. He learned that trust must be rebuilt through consistent actions over time rather than just apologetic words, and that real love sometimes means making hard choices that prioritize long-term well-being over short-term happiness. Our new beginning felt cautiously hopeful as I stood in my office 6 months after the trial. I had a photo of Mom on my desk where I could see her smile every day, a constant reminder of why fighting for truth mattered so much. I looked out at the city, stretching beyond my window, feeling more settled and confident than I had in years. My phone buzzed with a text from Sutton planning our next girls' weekend, making me smile at how my best friend had literally climbed walls to help me when I needed her most. An email notification appeared from Mr. Takahashi, praising my latest strategic proposal for expanding our partnership into new territories, validation that I'd earned my position through merit and leadership rather than just family connections. A knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts, and Dad appeared asking if I had time for coffee. We'd made this a regular habit, meeting for coffee in my office or his several times a week to talk about business and life, and slowly rebuild our relationship through these small moments of connection. I poured us both cups from the machine in my office, and we sat in comfortable chairs by the window, no longer needing to fill every silence with words. Dad looked at Mom's photo on my desk, his eyes soft with remembered love and lingering grief. "Your mother would be so proud of who you've become," he said quietly, his voice catching slightly on the emotion. "She taught you to fight for truth even when it hurts, and you honored her memory in the most powerful way possible." I felt tears prick my eyes, but I smiled through them, feeling Mom's presence in the room with us in a way that brought comfort rather than pain. "She taught me that strength isn't avoiding pain," I replied, looking at Dad with understanding. "It's facing it, processing it, and choosing to move forward without letting it destroy who you are." We looked at Catherine's photo together, both of us acknowledging the woman who had shaped our lives and whose death had nearly broken us, but ultimately led us back to each other through the hard work of justice and healing. The wisdom I gained from this experience shaped everything about how I moved through the world. I learned that some people see vulnerability as an opportunity for exploitation, viewing grief and pain as weaknesses to manipulate for personal gain. But I also learned that vulnerability can be the catalyst for tremendous growth and strength when you refuse to let it define or defeat you. I'd lost my innocence and my naive belief that family always protected family, but I'd gained wisdom about human nature and the importance of vigilance, even with people we want to trust. The scars remained, visible in my cautiousness around new people and my instinct to document and verify rather than accept things at face value. But those scars were proof of survival, evidence that I'd faced something terrible and come through it stronger rather than broken. Real strength, I realized, wasn't pretending the scars didn't exist or acting like I hadn't been hurt. Real strength was acknowledging the damage while refusing to let it stop me from building a meaningful life and trusting carefully chosen people who earned that trust through consistent actions over time. I wanted anyone hearing this story to understand crucial warning signs that might save them from similar manipulation. If someone tries to isolate you from people who love you and have known you longest, that's a major red flag signaling danger rather than care. If someone rushes intimacy or pushes for major life decisions before you've had time to really know them, be extremely cautious because genuine love isn't afraid of taking time to build properly. Trust should develop gradually over months and years of consistent behavior. Anyone demanding instant complete trust is showing you exactly why they shouldn't be trusted. Your instincts exist for powerful evolutionary reasons, alerting you to danger even when you can't consciously identify what's wrong. Listen to that voice in your gut that says something feels off, even when surface appearances seem fine and everyone else insists you're overreacting. Speaking truth to power requires tremendous courage, because powerful people can make your life difficult when you challenge their version of reality, but silence has its own devastating cost. Sometimes, protecting yourself and others requires standing alone against popular opinion, trusting what you know to be true even when evidence seems to contradict your instincts. Family relationships worth saving require genuine work from both sides, including willingness to acknowledge mistakes, make meaningful changes, and rebuild trust through consistent behavior over time. Not all family relationships can or should be saved, especially if the other person refuses to acknowledge harm or continues destructive patterns. But when both people commit to honesty and growth, even badly damaged relationships can be rebuilt into something stronger than they were before because they're founded on reality rather than illusion. Standing in my office with Dad's hand on my shoulder and Mom's smile watching from the photo frame, I finally understood what really mattered in life. The greatest inheritance isn't money, power, or the family name that opens doors in business circles. The greatest inheritance is the courage to fight for truth even when doing so costs you everything you thought you wanted, the strength to forgive without forgetting the lessons that pain taught you, and the wisdom to know that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that save your soul from becoming something you can't recognize in the mirror. Life wasn't perfect now, and I still had moments of grief for my mother and anger about everything Veronica had stolen from our family. But life was authentic again, built on truth rather than manipulation, and that authenticity was worth more than any amount of money or false peace. There were no more masks hiding evil intentions, no more games being played with my emotions and my future. Just real people doing real work to heal real wounds, and that simple, honest reality was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered. Everything Mom had tried to teach me about integrity and courage. Everything that made life worth living fully and bravely, despite all the risks that came with opening your heart to other people. So, tell me in the comments, have you ever dealt with someone who tried to manipulate or isolate you from people who genuinely cared about you? How did you recognize what was happening, and what did you do to protect yourself? I'd love to hear your stories, because sharing these experiences helps all of us learn to recognize warning signs before it's too late. If this story resonated with you, or helped you see a situation in your own life more clearly, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories about standing up for truth and finding strength in the hardest moments of life. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can talk honestly about difficult experiences without judgment. I'm sending you all strength and courage for whatever battles you're facing in your own lives. Remember that you're never as alone as you feel in your darkest moments, and that speaking truth, even when your voice shakes, is one of the bravest things you can ever do. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that protecting yourself is wrong. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next story.